So you can see all these things either side of me and various other financial gifts people have made. Harvest is a tradition. It's not exclusively church one, but different churches do this in different ways. But the essence is that thanksgiving to God. Just after the harvest time, we acknowledge that everything is from God, and we offer some of that to Him by giving to those who are in more need. And in some ways it's odd. I was brought up in a rural area, so kind of harvest made sense there. I don't know if I've lived in cities where they should have shared dividend day or factory output day, but it's the same idea, isn't it, that God provides by whatever means. So most of us don't take our food out of the field. We take it from a shop, who took it from a truck, who somewhere down the line took it from a field. We give God thanks for everything that we have to live by, in fact more than enough to live by, to enjoy and to give. And so here we've got some food and domestic products that are going to go to Dennis has taken them after service to the food bank locally. We've got money that's going to go to Pomoja, a project we support in Africa. And it raises the question then, what is it? What is Jesus like? From what we're thinking about with the finances to Pomoja and this stuff here, what is Jesus like? Is he generous? Because not everybody could do this. Not everyone, the fact we're doing this shows that not everyone has enough. And then ask the question to ourselves, how do we use that which is given us? And that's what the parable is that Ben read a moment ago. There's a rich man, he's a farmer or a landowner, because it speaks of him sowing and reaping and gathering, some versions say harvesting. And so he does this, but he also is away, he travels, and he leaves his property and resources with 3 servants. And then he returns and asks how they've done, and rewards and punishes accordingly. So that's the parable, but as we work through it, we want to notice a few things. We want to notice the character of the master, the character of the one who gives us everything. And then look at the responses of the servants. The faithful servants he rewards, the others he punishes. And what is the difference between the two? And we see it's an attitude difference, and that asks us pointed questions about our attitude to Jesus. So firstly, look at the character of the master in verses 14 and 15. There's a problem, particularly with the third servant, about this delay. It raises questions for him about the character of the master. Does it mean, because he's delayed, that he's uncaring or out of control? And that's the question from the third servant. Well, let's have a look. Verse 14, he entrusts his property to the servants. And verse 15, he parcels out specific amounts. They're large amounts in verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. Now, what is a talent? What does the talent represent? It's a question we often ask, because in English, a talent means a gift or an ability that you have. So some of you have certain talents that the rest of us don't have. So we just saw people playing the piano and the guitar, and not just playing it well enough, but playing it well enough to play in front of you and stay at the same time. The last bit's the hard bit, in the time for us to follow. So that's a bit of a talent. Does it mean that we have different talents like that God has given us? Well, the English word talent actually comes from this parable. So it doesn't mean quite what we mean. And I think we're not meant to take the parable, the talent, in an over-specific way and think, what does it represent? But the footnote helps us that a talent is a sum of money. The talent is 20 years' wages. So I like to do this sometimes, is to try and think what that would mean for us. So the UK average wage is around £35,000. So 20 years, so times 35,000 by 20 is £750,000. So each servant he gives 5 times, 2 times, and 1 times a talent, the average wage, or a year, well, we don't know if it's an average wage, but 20 years' salary. So the first servant, that means in our money, that is £3.75 million. The second one, £2.25 million. I rounded it up slightly, or down. And the third one is £250,000. So the point of the talent here is, and the number of talents, is the quantity. These are large sums of money that he gives his servants. So what does that tell us about the master? Well, he's willing to entrust his servants with responsibility. He is himself well-resourced. Later on he says, you did well with little. A mere £750,000. Well done. He is generous. He's giving millions of pounds. But also, he's a risk taker. If you had a few million, if you had 20 million, who would you say, there's 5 million, make good use of it? I'm guessing very few of us. He's a risk taker. He's given lots of money to his servants. What could happen next? Well, they could lose it in a bad investment. They could filter it off and spend it on stuff they want to. And then he comes back and they're not there. He's a risk taker. He takes a risk with his money. He's taking a risk with his servants. So what does that tell us about Jesus? Jesus, in these parables, it's a bit different to the ones Ben's looking at from Luke, but there's some overlap. In the parable, the master represents Jesus, and that Jesus is with them, then he'll be away, and then he'll come back. What does it tell us about what he is like? Well, it tells us that he will leave, and that he will come back, and we're in that middle stage. And we may feel from Jesus under-resourced. I feel under-resourced at times. As a church, we feel under-resourced. But Jesus isn't. All things are his. But he takes what looks to us like a risk. It looks reckless and irresponsible. And that's what he's done with you. It's what he's done with us as a church. It's what he's done with you as a Christian. And the question for us, we'll come back to this, is how do we use the gifts that he gives us and the time that he gives us? And that will depend largely on what do you think he's like? What do you think of him? So let's look at the responses. We see how the servants use the talents before the day of his return, and then the master comes home and he says, how do you do? And then how does he respond to them? So verse 15 again. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. So there are 3 servants. He gives them different amounts. 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. And it says each according to his ability. So he's taking a risk, but it is a calculated risk. He entrusts some with more than he does with others. But even the one with just the 1 talent, he's given the equivalent of £750,000. He may well be going, oh, well, if I had 5 talents, but he didn't. He's got the 1. It's a calculated risk, and we see in a moment he did that with good cause. So look at the first 2 servants first. So as you read on, verse 16, the servant with 5, when he comes back, has managed to earn 5 more. He's doubled his earnings. Verse 17, the same with the servant with 2. He's earned 2 more. And so when he returns in verse 19, look how he treats them both. Verse 20, the first servant, he says, look, I've earned 5 more. And verse 21, his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. So he's saying, he congratulates him. Congratulations, you've been faithful over little. Little. You've been faithful over several £1,000,000. But let's not trifle over that. And so he gives him more responsibility and invites him into his joy. Verse 22 and 23 is a mirror of that. Verse 22, the second one comes along with, he's been given 2, he's earned 2 more. Verse 23, he's congratulated and given more responsibility and invited into joy. So the master notices their faithfulness, and he gives them more and gives them joy. And let's look at what he doesn't say. let's look at what it's not about. Sometimes that's important, what isn't said. It's not about success. It doesn't even mean if you take a risk, you'll be successful with it, that God will reward it. There's no promise of that, although it's interesting that's how it pans out. The point is the servants were given something to do, and they do it. They're given something to invest, and they invest it, perhaps with great nerves, as they did say. They are only servants, but they're given huge responsibility with vast sums of money, but they invest it anyway. They could have lost much of it, but the master took a risk with them, and they take a risk with what they were given. They do as they're told. So notice what the master does not say. He does not say, well done, good and successful servant. The point here is that they were good and faithful servants. Now they had success, but it is the faithfulness that is rewarded. And their faithfulness, part of their faithfulness, is taking the risk they were asked to take. So they're faithful, and good, calculated risk is rewarded. Now that's a question to us about using what God has given us. And the context is especially between Jesus' first and second comings, where we stand, and all that we have between. So I thought this before. If I had a mere £10 million, or maybe even 100, I could do even more, I know how I'd spend it. And it's not what you're thinking. It wouldn't be an Aston Martin packed up. Well, maybe there would be. But there probably wouldn't be. I would want to make sure that I wasn't a burden to anybody. But then I can think of things here and various mission agencies and things where we could do a lot of good if only I had it. The point is I don't. What do I do with what I do have? A friend of mine, I may have told you this before, I was staying at a friend's, he was a minister, and very early in the morning we were woken with a phone call from a lady in a bit of a panic. She was a single mum, she worked long hours, and she'd been dropped in it by childcare, and she just said, what do I do? And he said, come round, I'll pick up the child, and they were homeschooling their kids at the time, so we can absorb this. And he said to me, isn't this exciting? What might God give us next? And I went, it's a bit of a strange question. What do you mean? And he said, well, it would be nice when it's have a church where we can say, yeah, sure, bring the child over to the daycare facility. We'll fund this from the Deacon's Fund as she goes to into our daycare centre. Which they didn't have, because they're a bit like us, in sort of size and situation, so on. But he's saying, but if we use what we have got, what God has given us, if we're good stewards with this, what might he do next? It's about taking the opportunities and then maybe being entrusted. Well, don't take the opportunities, he doesn't entrust us with more. Now, I've been to churches that are extremely well resourced and then walked away questioning, what are they doing with it? Is it just that it's nice? And some churches, some Christians have very few resources, but they steward it well and God sees that. And of course, the same in reverse, isn't it? Others have got vast resources and they have managed it well. And they're generous and they look to others. And some small churches, even with the little they have, they manage to squander it. And they use their smallness as an excuse for what they're not doing. If we can be trusted with little, if we can't be trusted with little, we can't be trusted with a lot. It sounds easier to have a lot. And I have worked for a big church, and to be honest, it is easier. It has its challenges, but it is easier. Size is not in itself the issue. Neither is success the issue. But do we use what we have well? Are we willing to risk it, or do we want to protect it? The challenge is, will you be like these two servants? Well, let's look at the other servant. What's he like? He doesn't invest. Verse 18. He takes the 1 talent, he digs a hole, and he buries it. And there's a reason for why he does that. It comes up in verse 24 and 25. So he who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I have no seed. It provokes anger from him. If you go on a bit further, next verse, he asks a question. He says, then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what's my own with interest. So what does the servant think of the master? And is that fair? Does he have evidence to think that? Think back. What have we already seen of the master? See, he thinks his master is harsh and unreasonable. But is it fair that he thinks that? And the answer is no. He's given millions of pounds to invest. So the master has shown some wisdom as to why he didn't give them all the same. But he's still generous, outrageously so, and he's a risk taker. There's no evidence that he is harsh and unreasonable. The master says, at least put it on interest. I would have got something back. Now, even at 1% interest, that would have been £7,500 a year. And you know what it's like. It could be better depending who you invest with. You know, you get on the radio adverts, you get the clauses where your your investment may go up or down. But they would have tried to do that. And this is quite pointed at us, because we've seen what the master is like. We've got evidence of what the master is like just standing around me this morning. He's well resourced. He's generous. He's a risk taker. Outrageously so. But it begs the question of us. What do you think of Jesus? What do you think he is like with you and with the church? Now, you know the right answer, but what do you actually think? What do you feel on an emotional level about this? Do you feel doing as Christ asked? Well, he is harsh and unreasonable, and they'll criticise you if you get it wrong. Now, I'm talking about getting it wrong. I'm not talking about sin. That's a different question. Now, I'll be honest. I know the answer, and I preach it all the time. But I fear risk. I've noticed as I get older, and hopefully there'll be more time to do that. But I don't find that easy. I feel emotionally that there's been times that I've stepped out and taken a risk, and it's not gone as I hoped. I feel that I'd be like one of these servants and going, yeah, you know that talent? Yeah, bit awkward. It's sort of gone, mostly. Now what then? Is God going to be annoyed with me? Is he going to be annoyed with us? What do you think? What is he like? And this is an observation someone's made about the difference between all religions and worldviews and Christianity. This is the difference. Everyone else, I've stuffed up, Dad will kill me. The gospel, I've stuffed up, better call Dad. Now, which view do you have of God? Which view best fits Jesus? So we can be so worried about failure that actually we do nothing. You know, so I can't share the gospel with this person, they might not like me anymore. Now do the calculus. That's not that bad. Or we don't have a framework that Jesus will come back, so there's no urgency in what we do. Now, we could at least earn interest, whatever that is, in our situations. The point is not to sit on what we have, the time, the money, the resources, the people, but put it to use until the master returns. But it might go wrong. It might. We may lose it all in godly risk, but that will be godly loss. We may feel we don't want to take the risk. We may stuff up. We may get it wrong. We may feel under-resourced. We don't want to lose the little that you have. Jesus is a risk taker. He has recklessly invested in you. Now notice the servant didn't lose the talent. He just did nothing with it. And that was the worst thing. I think the master would have been fine if he'd lost it. Godly failure is okay. I remember it was Better Resource Church, but nonetheless, the minister saying, for God's sake, let's fail at something. Obviously, we need to put that failure into a bigger context, a bigger framework. When we invest in church, in people, in proclaiming the gospel, in finances and giving to those in need, always, if you do the sums on paper, it is a bad investment. It doesn't always pan out as we hope either, and that is hard to swallow. But God is still using it, and the fruit of that is often not in our lifetime. The greater risk is doing nothing. Now let's look at the outcomes of that then in verses 28 to 30. Verse 28, the master commands that the talent be taken from that servant and given to the one who now has 10. And I did read a commentary once that said, this is capitalism at work, isn't it terrible? I don't know where he thinks Jesus stands with that, but verse 29, it says, for to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Those who do not faithfully use this time before Christ comes, even what he has will be taken and given to those who have been faithfully waiting. D.L. Moody says, God prefers the way I do it to the way that you don't. And often as evangelicals, particularly the more reformed end of the pitch, we can be so concerned about doing things right and being sound, and that's good. We're so concerned we do nothing because we're fearful of doing it wrong or losing. Some of you came with me. We did a thing, we were sitting in Hall Street, we did a little morning on sharing the gospel in the street, and we went out to the street and did it. And the guy who did a bit of training with us said, when you do that, never imagine Darren in front of me, never imagine Darren over your shoulder listening to what you say, because you might be worried, I won't worry if you get it wrong, but you're worried they might get it wrong, and so you say nothing. God can use what you get wrong. But we're too fearful of that. And so we notice, don't we, other Christians and churches, and they sometimes do things in a way that just infuriate us, and with good reason. But they're doing it. They're getting on with it. They're taking risks. And we noticed, don't we, that over the last 100 years or so, the gravity of the church has shifted. It's gone from old denominations to new. But back at what I was saying, doesn't mean to say we should do things wrong. I'm just saying it's the doing nothing that is the problem. So there's a shift between old denominations and new. There's a shift between the global west and the global east, and the global north to the global south, where all the Christians are. Now, the churches in the west and the churches in the north is where all the resources were. And what have we done with them? Not much. Where's the church growing? Where the resources weren't. What the resources they used were. The talent has been taken from the one that had many and given to one that uses it. And the parable closes in a very solemn way in verse 30. Cast the worthless servant into outer darkness, in the place where there will be a weeping and a gnashing of teeth. Now, why is it that serious? And is that a risk for us? Now we get to the nub of the problem this servant has got. I don't think it's that he's cautious. Some of us are naturally cautious. This isn't to beat you up if you're cautious. Cautious comes from a good place. You may have just gone a bit too far. But the servant does have two problems. And this is significant to everyone in the room actually. If you're a Christian, if you're someone who's sort of chewing this over, it's the same thing. So the first is that he's not ready. He's not ready. He questions the question, does he believe the master's word that he will come back? Do you believe that Jesus is coming back? Do you believe that you will meet him? Because every one of you, and everyone who's not here, and everyone you know, will meet Jesus. And so are you ready to do that? Do you know him? Are you prepared for meeting with him? Does it fill you with joy or fear? If you're a Christian, that means, so if you're not ready, get ready. And if you are a Christian, how do you use the time and the opportunity and the resources that you have that God has given you? Right, second thing is related to that is, What do you think Jesus is like? So are you ready for him to come back? But what do you think he's actually like? Why are you afraid to lose anything? Why are you afraid of meeting him? The servant has a dim view of the master's character, and he fears messing up. We fear sharing the gospel because we might get it wrong. We fear doing something, whether it's in your private devotion, some response you want to make to Jesus, or something you might want to do as a church. We fear we might get it wrong, that it might fail. Who are you fearing? What's worrying you? Often it's the friendship. Do you fear your friends more than Jesus' approval? Now, all the evidence would show that Jesus is happy with your risk. He's happy with your failure on an individual and a church level. I think it's an encouragement to the Christian to be ready always and work towards his return. Know Jesus' character, know it more, get to know it more deeply, to study and learn it, to know it experientially and emotionally, to trust him, and to step out an apparent risk that is no risk at all, because he has infinite resources, and your mistakes and your miscalculations he'd already factored in. Encouragement to the non-Christian or the one chewing this over is be ready. Jesus is coming. Now is the time of grace, but it won't go on forever. Stop dithering about it. Why would you? If you don't think he's returning, or if you're uncertain of his character, that'd be the reasons why you dither. Harvest is a reminder that Jesus is good, and he is better to us than we deserve. Jesus is good, he is generous, and he appears to take a risk with us. The long delay is not a lack of care, but an act of mercy, giving us time. Now, more about this to come, so we think more about his nature and him seeking us. We're thinking about that in Sunday mornings, in Song of Songs, in the evenings, Kingdom Parables. You can consider this more specifically in Christianity Explored. He is good, and he wants nothing from you. The results and the outcomes, let him worry about. He wants nothing from you, but he does want you. And he's offering blessing and entry into his joy. Don't put it off, and don't miss out on it.